Hi, my name is Tanya Golash-Boza. I just published this book, and I wrote it because I wanted to better understand how and why the city where I was born and raised has changed and why racial inequality persists. Let's start with the racial wealth gap. White people in the United States have, on average, 8 times the wealth of black people. Wealth is important because it can be used to create opportunities, maintain financial security, and pass along the legacy to the next generation. This is particularly the case in the United States, where an unexpected medical bill can put you in lifelong debt. And it's nearly impossible to send your children to university without significant wealth unless you want to put them in lifelong debt. People who study wealth in the United States focus on home ownership because inequality in home equity accounts for most of the racial wealth gap. White people have more wealth than black people, in large part because they're more likely to own homes and therefore to have home equity. Home equity refers to the amount of money the home is worth minus any money owed on the mortgage. There's a significant racial home ownership gap in the United States. Less than half of black people own the home where they live as compared to 3/4 of white people. Activists have long fought to narrow the racial home ownership gap because of its relationship to the racial wealth gap. It seems logical that we can narrow the wealth gap by promoting black homeownership, but is this true? I will explore how homeownership has created wealth in white communities, whereas black communities in Washington, D.C. have been subjected to disinvestment, carceral investment, and gentrification. First, let's take a look at why white homeownership leads to white wealth. The assumption that home ownership will lead to wealth accumulation is based on the experiences of white homeowners. For white people, home ownership has translated into intergenerational wealth because their homes have consistently increased in value. White people benefited from federally subsidized home ownership programs created in the aftermath of the Great Depression that allowed them to get favorable terms for their mortgages. White neighborhoods featured well-funded schools, and school quality is highly correlated with home values. This combination of community assets and public investment allowed white people's homes to increase in value. Many people think that hard work leads to wealth, but wealth mostly comes from public investment. What about black homeowners? Black people also purchased homes during the housing boom of the mid-20th century. Whereas only 1 in 5 black people lived in homes they owned in 1940, by 1950, 1 in 3 did. And by 1970, over 40% of black people lived in homes they owned. Notably, there was a greater percentage increase in black home ownership than white home ownership each decade between 1940 and 1970. The number of black homeowners in Washington, D.C. increased sixfold between 1940 and 1970. By 1970, there were 45,000 black homeowners in D.C. Despite this growth in home ownership for black people in D.C., we continue to see significant wealth inequality. In the Washington metropolitan area, white people have 81 times the wealth of black people. High rates of home ownership did not reduce the racial wealth gap in D.C. So let's take a look at why black homeownership did not lead to black wealth. In order to do that, we're going to have to go back to the 1950s. Now, Dr. Clarence Hinton was the first black homebuyer on his block. He purchased a home on 13th and Farragut Streets Northwest in 1953. Within a generation, the Hinton's block became all black. White flight happened across the city. The white population of the district decreased by 1/3 in a generation. White flight also opened up home ownership opportunities for black people. By 1980, there were over 50,000 black homeowners in D.C. This, however, has not translated into intergenerational wealth for black families in D.C. Simply increasing access to home ownership is unlikely to diminish the wealth gap because neighborhoods where black people live have consistently experienced disinvestment, and this is what needs to change. Whereas white neighborhoods got federal subsidies and good schools, black neighborhoods experienced disinvestment. Segregation allowed the state to redirect resources away from black communities. By the 1980s, D.C. public housing and the D.C. public school system almost exclusively served the black community, and these two public goods were greatly diminished due to disinvestment. Let's take a close look at what happened to Theodore Roosevelt High School. This is the high school that serves the Petworth community and the school that the Dr. Hinton's daughters attended. Roosevelt High was desegregated in 1954 and became majority black within a few years. Roosevelt High had been an excellent school prior to desegregation. It continued to provide a first-rate education at least until the 1970s, when Bonnie Benson, daughter of Ezra Taft Benson, Secretary of Agriculture, enrolled in Roosevelt High in 1955. It was a blue ribbon school, noted for its high standards of scholarship and its record of sending a large percentage of its students to college. As Roosevelt High became majority black, it continued to offer an excellent education to black students. Dr. Hinton sent his daughter Audrey to Roosevelt High in 1961, 7 years after the school was first integrated. Many of Audrey's classmates have done exceedingly well. Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson, who graduated from Roosevelt in 1964, became the first black woman to earn a doctorate at MIT. Sharon Pratt became the mayor of D.C., and Dr. Charlene Drew Jarvis became the president of Southeastern University. These highly successful black women all attended Roosevelt High in the 1950s and 1960s. However, by 1992, Roosevelt High ranked nearly last at 16 out of 17 schools in D.C. for its promotion rate. 1 in 3 students who enrolled in the 9th grade at Roosevelt High did not graduate from high school. In that same year, only 33 of Roosevelt's 915 students enrolled in advanced placement exams, and not one of them passed the AP exam. Roosevelt High went from being one of the best schools in the city in the 1960s to one of the worst by the 1980s. Schools are often reflections of their neighborhoods, so what had changed? The short answer is the race of the neighborhood residents. As Roosevelt High and most of the other public schools in D.C. became majority black, they experienced disinvestment. In Petworth and other black neighborhoods in D.C., public schools experienced disinvestment in the aftermath of white flight. As white people were fleeing the city, black people were arriving in large numbers. Thus, the city's school population grew from 100,000 to 150,000 students between 1954 and 1970. Congress didn't allocate enough funds to the public school system to accommodate this growth, and the school system, which already had problems, worsened. By 1970, 99.1% of black students in D.C. attended majority black schools, the highest percentage in the nation. The small number of white students in the DCPS system primarily attended schools on the west side of the park that were nearly all white. The city's response to the problems created by the violence of disinvestment was not to begin to invest in schools and communities in ways that would support them. Instead, the response was to invest in prisons and policing in ways that would punish them. In D.C. and across the country, the local and federal government began a war on drugs that would devastate black communities for generations. In a 1989 congressional hearing on appropriations, Mayor Marion Barry referred to the war on drugs as the city's #1 priority. This was not just a verbal commitment. In that same hearing, Mayor Barry explained that this prioritization meant the city would funnel more money towards law enforcement and corrections. The city redirected nearly $80 million away from the Department of Public Works, the Department of Housing and Community Development, the Department of Recreation, the Department of Employment Services, and the University of the District of Columbia, and towards law enforcement and corrections. The city's $3 billion budget for 1990 included just $20 million for drug treatment as compared to $227 million for corrections. The city's overwhelming response to problems associated with the drug trade was to strengthen the coercive arm of the state. Like Junkyard Band said in 1985, the trench is getting deeper for you and your honey. Reagan gave the Pentagon the food stamp money. Reagan also gave the prison system the public housing money. By 1997, fully half of young black men in D.C. were under the control of the criminal legal system. Black men in D.C. had an incarceration rate 36 times that of white men. Black neighborhoods in D.C. that experienced disinvestment and carceral investment in the 20th century began to be gentrified in the 21st century. This brings us to our last point, which is how disinvestment, heavy policing, mass incarceration, and stagnant home values set the stage for gentrification and the displacement of the black population from D.C. In 1970, Petworth was a majority black community, with half of black families living in homes they owned. Today, the neighborhood is only 50% black, and there are only 3,000 black homeowners. Black people who purchased a home in Petworth in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, or 80s would not see a return on this investment for decades. The median value of homes in Petworth remained steady from 1980 to 2000, meaning that investing in a home in Petworth in 1980 would not lead to increased wealth. It also means that it would be difficult to take out a second mortgage to complete expensive home repairs. Home values only increased in Petworth when white people moved in. The rise in home value in Petworth began in the 2000s, corresponding with the arrival of non-black residents in the neighborhood and a decline in the number of black homeowners. Disinvestment, combined with low housing prices, record low interest rates, and tax incentives, made Petworth attractive to investors after decades of abandonment. Now it was profitable for investors to purchase devalued houses, abandoned properties, and foreclosed homes to build new homes for new people. According to a report from Redfin, the average gain of a home flip in Petworth was $337,000 in 2016, higher than any other neighborhood in the U.S. Other D.C. neighborhoods where investors took in high profits on home sales included Brookland and Brightwood, neighborhoods that adjoin Petworth. The Hintons, mentioned earlier, purchased their home in 1953 for about $20,000. They lived in the neighborhood for 45 years before selling their home in 1998 for $230,000, making for a very small profit on a 45-year investment when we take inflation into account. The people who bought the home from them and sold it in 2019 for $700,000, a fair profit for a 20-year investment. 5 months later, the home sold for $1.3 million, a considerable profit for these investors. These investors made more money on the Hinton home in less than 6 months than the Hintons did in 45 years. When Petworth was primarily black, it experienced disinvestment and carceral investment, both of which worked in various ways to depopulate the neighborhood, making it an optimal site of reinvestment. Today, Petworth has become profitable once again, but has also become unaffordable for long-term residents. Decades of disinvestment in black neighborhoods in D.C. meant that home values remained stagnant, preventing black homeowners from accumulating wealth through homeownership. Schools in black home-owning communities had high dropout and low college enrollment rates in the 1980s and 1990s. When we add to this equation the carceral investment these neighborhoods experienced during the war on drugs, it becomes clear how and why black families in D.C. have had difficulty maintaining homeownership and building wealth across generations.